Hello, welcome everyone to the Conscious Chat number 4. And the topic is Chicanos are native. It's one of my favorite subjects here. Welcome to my channel. This is the Conscious Chicano. Um, I make videos here on different topics, pushing consciousness and Chicanismo, indigenismo, native identity, and uh, and read the details below. My ideal is to have 30 minutes of discussion on this topic, and then hopefully, if I'm not um, if I'm done by 30 minutes, the rest of the 30 minutes will be open to joining me on video, through chat, through dialogue, whatever on the topic. If you just remember, just read the chat rules below, and just keep it civil and respectful, and stay on topic. Okay. Um, so yeah, definitely. And if you choose not to join me on video, um, just send me some questions, or in the chat room, and I'll be willing to answer them. But and also read my details below and join me for uncensored information. Join me on my Rumble account. There's a link there. It's where there's more freedom to talk about certain topics where you don't get censored. So click on Rumble, that Rumble link, and also join me on Twitter. There's a lot of us, dropping knowledge there, uncensored knowledge. So Twitter's, there's a lot of good info there. And also join me on Instagram. Sometimes I'm on the go, and I do some live, I go on live, you know. But yeah, definitely. And welcome to my channel. This is Conscious Chat number 4. And the topic is Chicanos are native. Yes. So that's what this discussion just covers, probably a lot of stuff. um, so basically, when you're, Mexican in the United States, um, you grew up thinking that, you know, you're thinking that there's no awareness that you're actually indigenous, and a lot of times, a lot of Mexicans, Chicanos out here, um, they they're colonized in their mindset. They're confused, and it deals with a lot of colonialism and not knowing your history, not knowing who you are, so as you dig into your history and colonial past, I mean, actually, pre-colonial past, you know, you find out that Mexicans, Chicanos, um, come from the Americas, these lands, right? So-called Americas, right? And we've always been on this land, our people. We've been here for thousands and thousands of years prior to any European colonizing these lands. So, we have indigenous ancestry, and there's, us Mexicans come from different parts of Mexico, right? We have ancestors in different parts of Mexico, Chicanos as well. Some of us are born over here in this side of the border in the United States, and you trace our lineage. Some of it is, to natives here in the Southwest, in the United States, or in Mexico. Um, and it's important to know about this and trace your native ancestry. A lot of times we're bombarded and colonized in our minds. Even in Chicano studies, I'm very critical of Chicano studies, and because I seen what they teach in there. A lot of professors, they teach you false identities that you're Latino, right, or mestizo and everything. These identities that were created to erase your native identity, and we see a lot of this, being taught in Chicano studies, and uh, and I'm not saying all Chicano professors are like that. There's some Chicano professors who are promoting indigenous identity and everything. But when it comes to the whole identity issue, Mexicans, Chicanos, a lot of them are confused and they don't know about their native ancestry, you know. And it's due to colonialism, you know. And it's very complex, identity. Um, and I think it all goes back to history when the Spaniards, invaded Mexico. And if you read like books like the American Holocaust and everything, you'll learn about all the tragedies that the Europeans did to the natives. And a lot of Mexicans don't realize that they're survivors of one of the worst holocausts ever in human history, the indigenous Holocaust, you know. And so when you read books like American Holocaust, you can't see yourself as a mestizo or Latino or a Spaniard, right? You got to see yourself as the native who actually went through all that. This is what your ancestors went through, and you're survivors of that Holocaust, one of the worst Holocausts in the whole wide world. So so that historical experience has impacted the mindset of a lot of Mexicans and Chicanos out here. And so when the Spaniards came to the Americas and they came and colonized, they committed genocide, started taking native land, and they also were raping indigenous women. And here's where the confusion came in. They would, rape indigenous women, and they would have children that were half Spanish and half indigenous. And and what happened is that they created a caste system where you had certain types of races, right? So-called races, who were at the bottom, in the middle, and at the top. And so the caste system that was set up initially was that at the top of the pyramid was a Spaniard born in Spain, and then below that was a Spaniard born, say, in the Americas, in Mexico, right? And then below that you had like the so-called mestizo, right, who was half indigenous and half Spaniard. It was as a result of rape. And then at the bottom of that, you had like the full-blooded indigenous person, right? And sometimes there would be also African Americans. I mean, not African American, Africans, who were imported as slaves in Mexico in certain areas, like what is it, Veracruz and um, some of those coastal areas, but it wasn't a whole lot of them, as a lot of Afrocentrics claim. We have to be careful to say that the majority of Mexicans have African ancestry. Um, we have to be careful to say that the majority of Mexicans come from that African population that was brought by the Spaniards. So, but the way I am is, I will admit There's some Mexicans who do have African ancestry in those coastal areas, but to say that the majority have African ancestry is not correct. You know, we can't act like most Mexicans have African ancestry. So, but now you understand the pyramid structure. You know, it's like you have the brown people, like the natives, at the bottom. And even as well as Africans sometimes. The few that existed in colonial times, and then you have the so-called mestizo, and then you had the Spaniard who was born in the Americas, and then you had the Spaniard from Spain. So that was like the caste system. It was like kind of like a white supremacist system that was initially created in Mexico and throughout Latin America, so-called Latin America. You know, and I would say even amongst the English settlers and the French settlers too, say in Canada and the United States as well, the Portuguese in Brazil, same white supremacist caste system as well. Um, so this is actually how white supremacy came about, in the Americas, systemic as well. And so based on that caste system, it determined on whether you had access to education, to certain resources, um, determine your wealth, different things like that, and how you were treated in society and how you were perceived in society. And so that caste system brought a lot of systemic racism. So, and this caste system even had labels. They had a whole bunch of labels for all the different like people in this caste system. And eventually, after say the revolts, so-called independence from Spain, wasn't independence for indigenous people, but it was independence for, say, the Spaniards born in Mexico. So once they cut off the Spaniards from Spain, the Spaniards in Mexico and throughout Latin America still had, they were still at the top. And even to this very day, a lot of European Spaniards are at the top of this caste system that still exists in Mexico. And they are like the majority that pretty much control the government, you know, in Mexico and Latin America. So we still have this caste system, and and a lot of what was going on is a lot of times a lot of people think that most Mexicans are half Spanish and half indigenous. Well, the amount of Spaniards coming down to Mexico wasn't a lot. And so when they came to Mexico, they did they did occupy centers of power, you know, in some of the native populations, and so this is how they kind of conquered, they targeted like the main centers, right? And so in those areas, that's where, yeah, they did a lot of raping there. But in the outskirts of those empires, they weren't, they couldn't get to those populations, as much, So most of the people, say out of those centers of power, you know, didn't ended up not really having, they weren't being raped, as more rapes were occurring during those places like that were locations of where certain power structures existed in native societies. So, so, so we have to come to the thinking that most Mexicans do not have Spanish blood, and you could, and even the whole data on natives in Mexico is a bit dubious. And the way I am is, I'm trained in philosophy, and I I know a lot of mathematics as well. I got A in calculus. I know about, and I've helped students with mathematics, and I I'm very skeptical of data statistics, especially when you talk about history, because if you really think about data, it's like how could you really even tell, how can you even keep track of everybody in society? You can't even do that right now. Even the data in the modern times with all the technology we have is still not really accurate. You can manipulate data and say and conclude whatever you want. So I'm a bit skeptical of data. But even it's even worse when it comes to like history. And so when you look back into history, people conclude, oh, you know, this amount of people existed or this amount of people died and blah, blah, blah. Even to this very day, this amount of people identify as indigenous. And we have a problem with this whole indigenous data, right? And I come to the belief that there's actually more natives who are Mexican, more Mexican natives, more Chicano natives than we actually are told. So a lot of the data is they're claiming that I think I don't have the exact data at this moment, but I think it's probably 30% in Mexico, 30% of the population that is supposedly pure blood. Even that whole purity thing you have to question, but full blood, right? Native, and the rest are so-called mestizos. um, and you got like I think it's either 10% or 1% of Spaniards, or who are full blood, you know. And so when people repeat this data, I'm like, okay, first of all, we have a whole history of natives who were either forced to identify as mestizo and weren't actually mestizo, and then you had natives who wanted didn't want to identify as indigenous because of all the racism and structural racism and oppression. So they disguised themselves as being mestizo. So sometimes you had full blood natives who were calling themselves mestizo or identifying themselves as mestizo. So it complicates the whole mestizaje, data, So in reality, I think that the full blood native is more than 30% of the population. And a lot of people who we call mestizo are actually indigenous. And and so and then you have the question of mestizaje, is like natives out here in the United States. Some of them are mixed with European and native, and they still identify as native, right? But in Mexico, you have something that's still colonial, where you have maybe you do have someone who's half Spanish, half indigenous, but it's the racism towards indigenous people is so strong that they don't want to identify as indigenous. So they would rather call themselves mestizo or Spaniard, you know. And so this is part of the problem right here. So they may have indigenous blood in them, but they rather identify as European just for the benefits, you know. How's it going? Casual conversation. Yeah, if you just came in, I'm talking about Chicano and Native identity, and I'm talking about how the whole mestizo mindset is it has its roots in white supremacy and European colonialism, and so feel free to ask some questions as I go along, and I'll try to answer it. But yeah, definitely. The problem with mestizaje is like you have these Mexicans out here or Chicanos who they would rather identify as Spaniard or so-called mestizo instead of identifying with their native ancestry and history. And so, and this is part of it's like when you talk about their indigenous ancestry, they're ashamed of it, right? And there's even cases where they prefer to not even look indigenous, you know. They prefer their kids to even look European, you know. Or if they have a kid that looks native, they're like, oh, that's just unfortunate, you know. And it's like there's racism in Mexican society towards the native, their own. It's like a self-hatred, you know, and it comes from colonialism. So this whole mestizaje data, you have to question it because of this racism, a lot of natives are not saying that they're native; they're saying they're mestizo. And then even the ones who are half Spanish and half natives, they don't like their native ancestry a lot of times, and they'll say, "No, I'm not. No soy indio. I'm a mestizo, right?" And so there's this self hatred going on, you know, and it's due to colonial white supremacy, mental white supremacy, and it's still embedded in our culture. There's still, that happening, and and what happened is when the Spaniards came and they were doing, a lot of times you read in history books, oh, they married the indigenous woman, right? As though it was like a willing marriage and it was a happy marriage, right? And just think about it. When someone colonizes your land, you know, murders most of your people and commits genocide, enslaves them, takes your land, and then says, "Hey, you're going to get married to me." You know, that's that's not a real marriage. That's actually a rape. You know, so when history books say, "Oh, the Spaniard, the indigenous woman got married," no, think of it as a rape. So the Spaniards were doing forced marriages and also raping indigenous women, wherever they, you know, um, wherever they occupied. So, and because of that, because of these rapes, it caused confusion. So the children of the rape, some they would come out as Spanish and indigenous, and so this brought confusion. And so they set up a caste system. And what happened is people who were mixed were given more status than the full-blooded native. And so what happens is there caused division there. You know, this is what that's what they say a lot of times in the conscious movement. That the white man causes division, right? Or even in Christianity, the devil causes division, right? A divided house can't stand, right? So they created these labels, these identities, and so, okay, you're mestizo if you're half Spanish and half native, and this person is an Indio, which it's even that Indio is like racist too, you know. We're not from India, right? And so that's part of the confusion. And what happened is the Spaniards would give more status to the so-called mestizo, and so the mestizo would benefit from that social status and think of himself as, more superior than the Indio, right? And from there, the Indio would be mistreated, and looked down upon, and this caused like a whole racist attitude and mindset and structure. It was due to the Spaniard raping the indigenous woman and setting up this confusion. And this confusion still exists to this very day, where you still have Mexicans and Chicano not wanting to embrace their indigenous identity, and now even claiming Latino. Now this is part of the problem. Back in the day, they were identifying as Hispanic at times, right? And now it's a new generation is calling themselves Latinos, right? Anything but indigenous, right? So this comes from colonialism, and is due to a caste system of white supremacy that still exists in Mexico, as well as the whole Americas, Latin America, even the United States. But what's interesting, I like to compare the natives here in the United States with people in Mexico. And in Mexico, a lot of times they don't want to identify as indigenous, even if they're half Spaniard and half indigenous. They they'll it's not a trend to even want to be indigenous, right? And so, but in the United States, you'll have some natives who are half European, half white, and half native, and they're all proud of their native ancestry and their history, you know. So you got something. It's like Mexicans are and Chicanos are kind of like backwards. And I'm not speaking of all Chicanos and all Mexicans, because there's some Mexicans and Chicanos out here who know their history and culture, and they know who they are, and they're proud of it. But there's a lot of them out here who are not. I guess they're. I would say even a lot of them are not even educated on their history and culture, and they want nothing to do with indigenous identity. And so, understanding the caste system that was brought about by the Spanish colonization in Mexico, and that history, and how it has affected us even today and still has confused us, this is part of the problem here. And it's white supremacy. It's a white supremacist mindset. And this is why we have self hatred, and we despise our native ancestry and our native culture, even though we are indigenous. Most of our people eat their Mexican food, they have their Mexican traditions and all that, but they still like think of themselves as not indigenous, you know. And even the whole thing, oh, I'm Mexican and not indigenous. Even that whole mindset exists. So that's even part of the problem right there as well. So and then also sometimes we have the confusion of, okay, uh sometimes we have this thing that, oh, my great great grandmother or grandfather was Spanish, right? And it's like, okay, um you know it's still, you still have indigenous blood in you as well. So, but the issue is, you have to be realistic. You have to ask yourself, did some of your Spanish ancestors uh, did they force marriage, you know, or did they even rape your native ancestor in the past? You have to go all the way back and think about that, and just be realistic. Now, I'm not saying every Spaniard raped an indigenous woman out here, when they came to the Americas, but I will say the majority did, you know, and they were occupiers and colonizers. And am I saying to hate, you know, some of your Spanish relatives? I'm not promoting hate, but I'm just talking about history and facts. But a lot of times the reverse is actually happening. The reverse is like there's hatred towards native ancestry, and I seen a lot of Mexicans says, "Oh, I did a DNA test and it traces me back to Spain," and it's like, okay, you may have a Spaniard down the line who's one of your ancestors, right? But it doesn't erase the fact that most of them came and colonized and were involved in indigenous genocide and were raping native women and marrying them. And a lot of times all this machismo abuse was because of the Spaniards. They would force marriage on native women, and they would abuse the women. And this is where all this machismo abuse comes from, and especially in like Mexican marriages and relationships out here. So a lot of it, traces all the way back to colonialism. But here's the thing: what's funny is like you'll have like the what they say, a Mexican with a nopal, like all hardcore looking indigenous, and they do a DNA test and they say, "Oh, I have a Spanish ancestor," and they'll go as far as identifying as a Spaniard and even going to Spain and wanting everything to do with Spain. But then they have this shame, this they ignored their native, ancestry and history, and they're ashamed of it, and they wanna fit into society, the white supremacist caste system, and benefit from it. So there's no benefit in this system to be identifying as indigenous. So there is social benefits when you identify as a European, and this is because of the society it's white supremacist. So we have to be aware of that. And and like I said, Native Americans in the United States may have a European ancestor, right? But they identify as a native, and they identify as that, and they're proud of that. And look at the example of African Americans out here. You know, they may have British blood in them, right? They don't go out and say, "Oh, I'm so proud of my British slave master," right? Or my British slave master, he married a black woman, you know, and it's like I can't deny that. I got to be proud of that. You don't see that. Most African Americans are like, okay, yeah, some of us have some of this British, English blood in us or European blood, but they know the reality, the facts is that a lot of black women were being raped by Europeans. So it's being conscious of that, being aware of that, of that history, and knowing who you truly are. And so a lot of African Americans identify with their Africanness, you know, and it's backwards with Mexicans and Chicanos. They don't want to identify as indigenous. They'll identify as mestizo or Spaniard, and that's part of the problem out here. So this is the psychosis of white supremacy, Spanish colonization, especially amongst Chicanos and Mexicans out here. Um, and so let's see here. So yeah, casual conversation mentions that she's teaching her kids about being indigenous. Oh yeah, she says we didn't get that as kids. Yeah, you're right. You're right. Actually, the way I was, I kind of grew up a little different. I remember in high school, I was proud of being indigenous. Um, there was in my family, we knew there was talk about we were indigenous, and I do have indigenous ancestry, and even from the Southwest and Mexico. So um, there wasn't there wasn't as much shame in my family of being indigenous. You know, but I did have somebody who was part of the family who was uh, he was he was half Irish and Mexican, and he did have some racist views and everything. So I'm aware of that too. It's like, okay, I'm aware of, there was, there did exist racism in my family, and a lot of us actually knew about it, about that individual. But and a lot of times it's the older generations, who grew up that way. And but yeah, you're right. A lot of Mexicans out here. I kind of had I wasn't really conscious of a lot of native history back then. And as you grow up, you come across this and you start reading more and coming across more of this, and you start developing your true native consciousness, and start reading on your history and culture and everything. And that's really cool that you say you're teaching your kids. Yeah, they're getting a head start, like a head start. And I wish I was taught a lot of my native history and culture, at a young age. I had a sense I was native, and some of us in our family were proud of being native, but we didn't have a lot of historical knowledge on that. Um, so it's important. Although I have a great grandmother who talks about her experiences, so that's kind of historical as well, kind of like oral tradition in some sense of where she came from, who she was, and all that. But besides that, I think it's good that us Chicanos and Mexicans start teaching, the future generations about their native history and culture, everything. So that's very important right there. Um, and so also, oh yeah, you so casual conversation said, my same grandfather said his grandma was Chichimeca. Oh, okay, interesting. Yeah, Chichimecas. Yeah, there's a lot of history and culture as well. Um, yeah, I think a lot of the Chichimecas were northern Mexicans, kind of like around the border area. And so I have Chichimeca history as well, ancestry and culture and all that. So yeah, it's just interesting when the key is to learn your history and your culture and identify as indigenous, and we got to decolonize from this whole mestizaje mindset, this confusion. Actually, if you guys get a chance, get a book. It's a native scholar by the name of Jack D. Forbes. I actually had talks with him before he passed away. He has a book. It was Chicanos. Um, de Aztlan or something like that. I forgot the name. Here I go. Whenever I go on live, I forget names and titles, but when I'm off live, I have it like that. It's funny, but just look up Jack D. Forbes, and I think his book it might be Chicanos de Aztlan or something like that. Just look it up. There's a chapter in there, and he talks about he critiques the whole mestizaje identity, and basically says it's a colonial white, like it's a colonial identity. It's anti-indigenous. And and it even sparks confusion. So um, So he has some good insight on that. There's a guy I met too. His name was Victor Mejia. I actually met him too at the Chicano Studies Department at CISA, and that's when I was taking classical Nahuatl with Fermin Herrera, the professor, um, and I met Victor Mejia. He wrote a good article. I think he was like uh, uh, kind of like a journalist or something like that. I think he worked for what's it called, L.A. Weekly for a little bit, and he wrote a whole article similar to Jack D. Forbes' chapter, and how mestizaje brings confusion into amongst Chicanos and Mexicans, and it confuses people, and it's like it confuses them where they're neither here or there, and they don't know what to identify with, or they try to identify with everything, but they really don't have that much identity. And it's like, but he's basically advocating a native identity, and he's saying, and he goes into all the problems with the whole mestizaje identity mindset. So it's a good critique of it. You could actually Google it, Google Jack D. Forbes and mestizaje, or Google Victor Mejia and mestizaje. You, if you want some resources, go below to my Instagram and click on it and send me a message. This is how you can contact me, and I could give you links and resources and everything to check out if you want to get deeper on this whole thing. There's even a good video by a lady that her name is Citlali. She was in the Mexica movement. I used to be involved with the Mexica movement back in the day as well. But she does a video critiquing mestizaje too. It's really good as well. And she even talks about this one scholar from Mexico. I forgot his exact name, but he's really good at critiquing the whole mestizaje as being identity that stems from colonialism, white supremacy, a caste system, and everything. So that's very interesting. So um, yeah, so basically Mexicans, the root of confusion, the root of anti-indigenous stems from colonialism and even historical rape. And so what happens is that, you know, like I like to think of Malcolm X, and he has this speech, and he goes, who told you who you were? Who told you you were this and not that? Like, I'm just paraphrasing it, right? I don't have the exact quotes, but he's basically saying that the white man basically confused you, and you lost your identity. And that's so relevant even to Mexicans out here and Chicanos. So it's like, you know, the white man, the Spaniard came, he came and did a historical rape to natives out here, and eventually, confused them and told them who they were and who they weren't, you know. And this is the mental psychological deception that occurred from historic white supremacy. So it's important for Mexicans and Chicanos to decolonize from that and identify as indigenous, and even look up your ancestry too. And there's some decolonial native Mexicans out here who don't even identify as Mexican or Chicano. And I have my opinions about that. It depends on your view. Like, um, I understand like the whole Mexican nationalism was created by the Spaniards, but we can't give all the credit to the Spaniards. I think some of the Mexican nationalism was there was people who did have native blood who were promoting that as well and were involved in that. So we can't give just the Spaniards all the credit. So some say that they don't want to identify as Mexican, they rather identify as native, and they're saying the term Mexican is colonial, and it isn't actually. If you actually look at the word Mexican, Mexican comes from a native word, and Mexica, right? So you can argue against that and say that, well, Mexican is actually it's like a re-indigenation in some sense, or embracing our indigeneity, and by the fact that the word Mexican comes from a Nahuatl word, Mexica, right? So you can say it's not really a Spanish thing. Like if the root of it comes from an indigenous word, then you don't have a problem with saying that you're Mexican. But it's not to deny your particular native identity. So, like for example, I have Yaqui ancestry, right? And sometimes I call myself Mexican. And when I call myself Mexican, it's not like, oh, okay, I'm denying my Yaqui ancestry. No, it's just saying, hey, and it's like it's Yaqui is not my only ancestry. I have so many ancestors you can trace. I have ancestors all over northern Mexico and the Southwest. I have some Apache ancestry, um, Zacatecas and Sonora and different places like that in Mexico, Chihuahua. So um, so when I say I'm Mexican, I'm not really saying I'm a Spaniard, right? I'm just thinking of, oh, it's just reaffirming my indigeneity. And if I want to get particular, okay, then I start breaking down my ancestry, my native ancestry. But then you got some Mexicans out here straight from Mexico who are anti-Chicano, and they say, oh no, I'm not Chicano. I rather identify as native. But then it's like it's a misunderstanding of the word Chicano. So Chicano was kind of like, we created our own identity, and it wasn't the Spaniards, right? And so what I like about the I identifying as Chicano is kind of like it has a history to it. It's basically saying, okay, we weren't born in Mexico, which is true, and even us, who are born out here in the United States, we go to Mexico, they reject us. They call us pochos. They call us gringos and all that. So a lot of times they don't accept us, right? And then we're not accepted by the Anglo American society. So there's a lot of racism here, right? And so I think Chicano it's reasonable to embrace it and say, okay, we create our own identity, and this is who we are. And we Chicanos have our own history and culture here in the United States, right? And Chicano is not anti-indigenous. Chicano embraces our indigeneity. The problem with old school Chicanos is they identify as mestizo, right? Just like the Mexican does too, as well. And so we have this whole mestizaje mindset too. That's part of the problem. So Chicanos now, the newer generation, are identifying as natives. So this is good. The newer generation is identifying as indigenous. We're getting more Chicanos and Chicanas embracing in their native ancestry and identity and culture and history, promoting it, teaching it, and that's cool. And so the way I am is I don't see anything wrong with identifying Chicano. Saying you're Chicano is saying you're native as well. And a lot of people think, oh, to be native, you have to be in some reservation in the United States, or you have to have a native card, right? Well, there's some complexities with that. Even in the United States, some natives don't even like the whole native identity, tribal cards, and anything like that. They say, no, 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 I don't need the government to tell me that I'm native. There's some natives in Arizona who believe that. You know, so and for example, my great grandmother didn't want anything to do with the government. So when they were enrolling, people from her nation, she didn't want anything to do with the government. So that's the complexity there. And so to be native, do you have to be living in a reservation with an ID card? No. And even in Mexico, it's even more complex. So they don't have that kind of system. They don't have a card. Oh, I'm native, right? Mexico didn't want any of that system, right? And so it's very more complex than anything else. But here's what I say: a lot of brown communities, say for example, out here in Los Angeles, we have a lot of natives living here, you know, from different parts of Mexico, even Central America. You have Mayans, you have, you have natives from Mexico, and even natives here, you know, who all live with each other, right, in the same neighborhoods, the same barrios, right? And the way I see it is that people distinguish the U.S. reservation natives from everybody else, right? And my thing is like, if you actually learn about the reservations and everything, they're like the barrios too, the ghettos, right? Or it's low income people and everything, and a lot of what's going on in the reservations, that is also happening with the barrios too. Out here in Los Angeles, uh, even understanding how tribes came about, you know, they migrated and formed their own neighborhoods, right? Even like the whole Calpuli system in Mexico, you had different tribes, different people combining with each other and eventually forming what's called a Calpuli system, right? So you got pe- people who would merge into tribes, and then tribes merge into Calpulis, right? And this happened in Mexico. And this happened also out here in the United States, where you had people who had formed tribes, right? And then tribes join other tribes and form what's called like a confederacy, right? So it's very complex, So the way I am is like, okay, you don't need a government to tell you that you're native, right? And so it's like, okay, if we compare the reservations to the say the brown neighborhoods out here, it's the same thing going on. There's natives living there, right? We still have our culture. We're still eating our foods, right? Our native foods. You know, we're a community of brown folks. Natives. All natives are basically brown. You know, most of them. Although sometimes I see these blonde hair people who are saying they're native. Maybe they do have some native ancestry, and it's very complex on that whole history. But if they have native ancestry, and they're they're on this decolonization tip, and they learn the native ways. Uh, hey, they identify as indigenous. Now, that's even complex too, but I'm not going to go all into that. You got people like Ward Churchill. Some claim that he's not really indigenous, but it's very complex. He actually wrote I think it was in some book or something like that, where he argues about against the whole blood quantum stuff, and he says something about oh, in certain tribes, if you have a certain blood quantum of native ancestry, okay, now you're native, right? But if you don't have that certain amount of blood quantum, oh, you're not native. And he makes some good points there. So Ward Churchill actually wrote some pretty good books. So I'm not um, talking against him. He has some good insight. A Little Matter of Genocide is a really great book. But it's a good insight on it, talks about the whole blood quantum issue. And what's interesting is like this was um, it's very complex, because sometimes you had white people coming in and at times trying to intermarry with the natives, and then they would try to take the land, right? They would try to take the land and the resources and everything. So that whole blood quantum issue came about. But then the government stepped in and started trying to erase uh, native eligibility and trying to reduce the population and try to say, okay, only you can be native because you have a certain blood quantum. So therefore, we're going to have a small amount of natives here, and we're going to take the rest of the land, right? So there's a lot of complexities to this whole blood quantum issue. It's very deep, but I like to think of like kind of like the African Americans, like okay, the way they think is like, oh, as long as you're have that blood, that drop of blood, kind of, and I think it even came from Europeans though. Is like if you have that drop of blood, you're black, right? And I think the African Americans did embrace that, and it's actually benefited in some way where okay, as long as you have black in you, you're black. Don't matter what you're mixed with. And this actually has actually made them more stronger as a people instead of being confused, all and not knowing who you are, right? Whereas with Mexicans, oh, they may have a lot of indigenous blood in them and probably a little blood quantum of Spaniard, right, or European, but they're all confused and they don't want to identify as indigenous and loss of identity and history and all that, and they identify as white, Latino, and all that stuff. So that's part of the problem, you know. So the way I am is like, as long as you have native in you, and you know your history, your culture, and you learn the cult, you realize your own culture. Sometimes you don't even have to relearn your indigenous culture. Some people say, "Oh, you got to learn the native ways." No, a lot of Mexicans and Chicanos, when you're practicing your culture, you're already native. You just have to have that self consciousness, that self realization. So a lot of us Chicanos are native, and we don't even know that, right? You know, we live in a community of indigenous people. As I drive around Los Angeles in my neighborhoods and all that, like, I see brown folks everywhere. I see native people everywhere. We all live, around each other, right? You know, and we are distinct from the white people who live in the rich areas most of the time. So we are indigenous people, whether it's like we have to come to that self-consciousness, that self-realization. Sometimes we may be speaking European languages, right? We're still native. I know some of these decolonization people in the Mexican community say, "Oh, if you don't speak now, what you're not native, right?" you know, or if you're not in the community, right? Like if you're not a now what speaking community, you're not truly native. That's just a bunch of nonsense. I say as long as you're in this brown community, you're practicing your cultural ways and all that. Um, you can't. Your identity as indigenous is not erased, right? Maybe you need to learn your native languages and learn about your ancestry more, your history, but that doesn't take your indigenous identity away from you. You know, a Chicano, a Mexican, a native, they can even move somewhere else, like somewhere outside the Americas, maybe to Hawaii or I don't know wherever. They're still going to be indigenous. Doesn't matter what language they speak. They still have that indigenous blood in them. You know. So we got a lot of this confusion. We got people who are saying, "Oh, you're not native," from different camps of thought out here. You got the Spanish colonial mindset, the mestizo mindset, and the hardcore legalistic native decolonial people who say, "Oh, you're not native if you're not doing it temazcal, right? Or if you don't speak Nahuatl, or you're not involved in the Nahuatl speaking community in Mexico or somewhere." That's just nonsense. But yeah. So, anyways, yeah, being Chicano, being indigenous, uh, that's who we are. And we had to come to that realization, you know, and embrace it. You know, um, embrace it and decolonize from all these false identities, especially Hispanic, Latino, mestizo, all that stuff. And stop being confused, because that's how they want you to be. They want you to be confused and not know who you are. That way they can control and manipulate you, so you can support their white supremacy, so you can support their empires, right? Their interests. You know, the more that they can wipe your indigenous identity away from you, it's like they can say, "Oh, natives don't exist anymore." And it's crazy because you have all these brown folks all around you, and they write in their history books that, "Oh, 90 some percent have been wiped out. Indigenous people don't exist anymore." That's why I'm skeptical of all this historical data and statistics. So, I'm a philosopher, also a mathematician as well, you know, and I know about data and how they can manipulate data even right now to make you believe certain things, or even in history. So you have to be skeptical of a lot of that data. Even when you read books like American Holocaust, they come out with all these statistics. Oh, and then they conclude that 90 some percent of the native population died out, right? That's just I from my philosophical observation, you just look around everywhere, you see brown folks. If you go to the Southwest, go walk around California, Los Angeles, Mexico, I see nothing but brown folks. And it doesn't seem like the majority were died out, right? That's just a bunch. That's this just doesn't make sense to me. So I would say that there's more indigenous populations out here than we actually are told in school, in the history books, in the documentaries out here, and we have to come to that realization. Anyways, I think I'm going to end it here. My talk on this. If any of you, I see that there's really nobody in the chat room. If if any of you want to ask some questions, send me a question in the chat room, or if you want to, you know, come on video and chit chat with me about this topic. Write a comment, and I'll give you 1 minute to say I would like to come on. If not, then I guess I'm going to end it here. And the topic is Chicano and Native identity. And yeah, definitely. So I'll just wait for 1 minute. And if nobody makes a comment, I'll just go ahead and close it up. But if you guys want some more resources and information on this topic, go to my Instagram below, click on the link, send me a message. I've been studying this whole stuff for a long time, history and culture and all this different controversial topics. And definitely, I took classes in it as well. Um, so definitely, yeah. So let's see here. I guess I'll close it up. Nobody's here, but Definitely read my get click on my links below. If you want to get deeper, go to my Rumble account or add me on Instagram. Click on my link or go to my Twitter below link, and we drop a lot of knowledge there. And definitely, I'm gonna end it here. You guys have a good day, and subscribe to this channel and let other brown folks know about this channel. Spread the knowledge. Anyways, you guys have a good day and see you later, and I'm out.